They branded her as weak, cast her out in front of thousands, and laughed as if her very existence was a mistake. The Empire's voices echoed through the grand amphitheater, cruel and unwavering, mocking her, dismissing her as an outcast. Every word, every pointed finger, every derisive glance hammered into her heart, but instead of breaking her, it ignited something far more dangerous. They had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated her. And that would be their first fatal mistake. As she stood there, stripped of rank, of recognition, of dignity, her eyes didn't waver. Her chest heaved with a kind of rage that can only come from being pushed to the edge, from having everything taken and still standing. She felt the sting of humiliation burn hotter than any pain she had ever endured. The crowd's jeers blurred into the background as a single thought consumed her. They will regret this. Every empire has weaknesses, every mighty power has cracks, and she would find them all. They thought she was powerless, but she was learning something far more valuable. Control. Focus. Patience. The council's voice cut through the amphitheater, dripping with contempt. An outcast. A failure to the empire, they proclaimed, as if words alone could erase her existence. The label should have been her death sentence. For most it would have been. But she had never been most people. From the moment she could remember, she had been defined by challenges, by defiance, by the hunger to survive against impossible odds. And survival, she realized, was only the beginning. The seeds of something unstoppable had already been planted. She walked away from the amphitheater with her head held high, though the weight of scorn threatened to bend her back. Her path forward was uncertain, her future erased by decree, yet she felt no fear. Fear was a luxury she could not afford, and weakness was a word that no longer applied to her. The Empire had branded her, but it could not define her. She was more than their judgment. She was more than their cruelty. And for the first time, she understood what it meant to be free from expectation, to be free from the chains of others' opinions. The Empire prided itself on order, on strength, on the illusion of control. Soldiers, administrators, and enforcers all believed they understood what it meant to wield power. But power without foresight is fragile. Authority without understanding is brittle. And cruelty without consequence is dangerous. Every insult, every act of derision, every public spectacle meant to humiliate her instead became a blueprint for her own strength. She analyzed it all, memorized every misstep, every arrogance-driven choice. The Empire was predictable. She would not be. In the days that followed, whispers began to follow her. Not of admiration, but of curiosity, of questions left unanswered. Who was this outcast who bore her shame so silently? How did she walk through the Empire's streets as if she owned nothing yet commanded attention? Those whispers, small and cautious, planted the first seeds of fear in the minds of her detractors. She watched, and she waited. Patience became her shield, silence her weapon. The world could laugh now. They would not be laughing for long. Every corner of the Empire she passed, every soldier that spat in her direction, every citizen who whispered her failure, fed the fire within her. Humanity had an instinct for survival that no alien empire could truly comprehend. It was in her eyes, in the way she carried herself, in the subtle tension in her shoulders, the calm before the storm. Her mind sharpened with strategy, her body honed with discipline, and her resolve solidified with each passing insult. Weakness was not an option, not anymore. They had given her a title, outcast. She would give them a reckoning far greater than any name could contain. Late at night, under the cold glare of the twin moons, she practiced in silence. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she knew preparation was everything. Strength without purpose is wasted. Anger without direction is destructive only to oneself. She studied the Empire's tactics, its armor, its technology, its hierarchy. Every flaw, every pattern, every predictable action became part of her knowledge. She could strike anywhere, any time, with precision no one expected. And when she did, there would be no forgiveness. There would be no mercy. There would only be consequence. She remembered the faces in the amphitheater, the sneers, the arrogance, the certainty that they were untouchable. The Empire had made a mistake, underestimating what humanity could endure and what she could become. In that realization, she found a new power, one far greater than any weapon, the certainty that nothing could break her now. She had been tested by humiliation and had emerged unshaken, her fury contained, her intellect focused, her path unbroken. And so, as dawn painted the sky in streaks of red and gold, she made a silent vow. The Empire had labeled her an outcast. It had tried to erase her. It had laughed at her weakness. They would witness what she would become. Not a soldier. Not a rebel. Something far more dangerous. A force they could not control. A storm they could not anticipate. A reckoning born of human will. The fire inside her roared quietly, unseen but undeniable. Every empire has its champions. Every oppressor its blind spots. Every tyrant its downfall. And she would be the instrument of that fall. The outcast would not just survive. She would become their unstoppable doom. And the universe, cold and indifferent as it seemed, would watch it unfold in awe. She walked away from the Empire's judgment and into a world that had forgotten her, a place where no eyes watched and no voices mocked. In that silence, she began to transform. Survival alone was no longer her goal. She sought mastery, understanding, and a plan that would turn every insult she had endured into power. Every step she took was deliberate, every breath measured, every thought sharpened. She was no longer reacting. She was calculating, learning, preparing. The exile that others would have seen as punishment became her greatest opportunity. She studied her environment, learning to adapt to terrain, to weather, to scarcity. Every challenge, every obstacle, became a lesson in human ingenuity. She discovered how to manipulate resources that others overlooked, how to improvise weapons, tools, and strategies from the simplest materials. While the Empire rested on machines, routines, and rigid protocol, she learned to trust her instincts and intelligence, to anticipate threats before they arrived. She became a student of survival, a master of adaptation, and a strategist beyond the reach of their rigid hierarchy. Loneliness could have crushed her, but instead, it became a forge. She used it to sharpen her mind, to refine her skills, to push herself beyond limits she had never imagined. Every failure was analyzed, every setback catalogued, every weakness acknowledged and then erased. The Empire had tried to define her by her limits, but she discovered that limits existed only for those who accepted them. Her mind became her greatest weapon, her endurance a silent threat. While the Empire trained legions in predictable tactics, she trained herself in unpredictability, in patience, in the kind of cunning that could not be contained by conventional measures of power. She encountered others along the way, beings from different worlds who had also been discarded or dismissed. They were strong, but rigid, confident but predictable. They underestimated her at first, as the Empire had. But she quickly demonstrated that what humans lacked in raw power, they made up for in creativity, adaptability, and the willingness to defy expectation. Alliances formed not through dominance, but through respect earned by brilliance, resilience, and insight. Even in isolation, she proved that humanity's greatest strength was not its numbers or its weapons, but its spirit, the drive to survive, to overcome, and to rise above insurmountable odds. Her training was not just physical. It was mental, tactical, and emotional. She studied the Empire's battles, their leaders, their technology. She observed patterns, habits, and weaknesses in a system that considered itself infallible. Every arrogance-driven decision they made, every display of superiority, became part of her arsenal. She learned to move silently, strike unpredictably, and exploit the tiniest miscalculations. Where they saw chaos, she saw opportunity. Where they relied on fear and control, she relied on precision and strategy. She was not simply preparing to fight. She was preparing to dismantle an entire empire through intellect, audacity, and the unyielding will of a single human mind. As she honed her skills, small victories began to accumulate. Scouting parties sent to capture or kill her vanished without trace. Supplies meant to hinder her found new purpose in her hands. She was not reckless. She was deliberate. Every action sent a message, not yet to the Empire, but to herself. She was capable of more than they had ever imagined. The whispers of her growing power traveled ahead of her, subtle and unnoticed, planting seeds of uncertainty among those who assumed that humans were weak, that she was weak. They had no idea that humanity thrived on being underestimated, that its brilliance often went unseen until it struck with precision. She experimented with technology, taking scraps and remnants abandoned by the Empire and reshaping them. Machines that were thought useless in inexperienced hands became instruments of strategy, surveillance, and defense. She transformed limitations into advantages, scarcity into resourcefulness, and isolation into a laboratory of possibilities. Every modification, every clever adaptation, reminded her that the Empire's reliance on conformity was its greatest flaw. They had built a fortress of certainty, and she was learning to turn it against them. Her patience became a weapon in itself. Unlike the Empire, which moved with the arrogance of inevitability, she moved with stealth, calculation, and timing. She struck only when the advantage was absolute, leaving no trace, no warning, no opportunity for counterattack. Each minor victory built her confidence, each challenge expanded her understanding, and each encounter reinforced a lesson the Empire would never learn. Humanity is not bound by predictability. While they relied on hierarchy and protocol, she relied on ingenuity, resilience, and the relentless drive to overcome impossible odds. Her transformation did not go unnoticed. Small rumors began to circulate within the Empire, whispers of an outcast who could not be captured, who struck with brilliance and vanished without warning. The first seeds of doubt entered their minds, subtle and disquieting. Generals began to question orders, soldiers hesitated in the field, and the Empire itself, so confident in its invincibility, began to feel the stirrings of unease. And while they were distracted by their growing anxiety, she was preparing for the moment that would truly define her power. The moment when the Empire would realize that underestimating a human was not a mistake to be forgiven, but a fatal error. By the time she emerged from her exile, she was no longer merely a survivor. She was a strategist, a tactician, a force of intellect and precision that no empire could anticipate. Every choice she made had purpose, every action was deliberate, and every movement was part of a plan that the Empire would never see coming. The outcast they had mocked was becoming a symbol of unstoppable human will. And when the first strike fell, the Empire would not know whether to fear her mind, her skill, or the sheer inevitability of her vengeance. The fire inside her had grown, quiet but unstoppable. Each lesson, each adaptation, each small victory built toward something larger, a reckoning that would prove beyond doubt that humanity was not to be underestimated. The Empire had branded her as weak, but weakness had been only an illusion. Beneath the surface burned the heart of a human mind capable of ingenuity, resilience, and a relentless drive to overturn injustice. Every empire has its blind spots, every tyrant its vulnerability, and every oppressor its reckoning. She had found hers, and she would strike with precision, intelligence, and fury. The Empire's laughter had fed her fire, and that fire would not be denied. The Empire believed itself untouchable, confident in the strength of its fleets, its armies, and its leaders. They had seen the outcast as nothing more than a curiosity, a minor inconvenience, a human who could be ignored without consequence. But humans were not so easily contained. She had studied them, every pattern, every arrogance, every assumption, and she understood something they never did. The Empire's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness, its reliance on predictability. Small victories became whispers that grew into unease. Patrols that had mocked her now returned empty-handed. Supply convoys vanished, communication lines faltered, and strategic operations failed in ways the Empire could not comprehend. Each loss was executed with precision, with the subtlety of someone who had learned patience, observation, and timing. The Empire began to feel the first twinges of doubt, an unfamiliar and dangerous sensation. No one questioned their superiority, but now the impossible had begun to unfold, and they did not know how to respond. Generals and advisors convened in tense meetings, their faces tight with anxiety, their voices low but urgent. They debated strategies, reinforced protocols, and demanded results, but nothing worked. Every attempt to predict or corner the outcast failed. The human mind was fluid, unpredictable, and relentless. Where they relied on brute force, she relied on foresight. Where they assumed control would yield obedience, she thrived on chaos. They had underestimated what humanity could endure, and more importantly, what a human could become when driven by injustice and determination. She moved in silence, unseen yet impactful, exploiting their arrogance with ruthless efficiency. Resources that had once been guarded became her instruments. Knowledge that had been dismissed became her advantage. Every misstep by the Empire was catalogued, analyzed, and turned into leverage. Soldiers trained for conventional combat found themselves outmatched not by strength, but by cunning. Strategies designed for overwhelming power crumbled under the weight of human ingenuity. They could not understand her because they had never encountered a species that thrived on being underestimated, a mind capable of turning humiliation into victory. Rumors began to spread among the lower ranks. Soldiers whispered of a human who could strike and vanish without trace, who anticipated every move before it happened, who turned weakness into strategy. The fear was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily. Confidence faltered, hesitation crept in, and the Empire's rigid order began to crack. They had been too proud to notice the human who had once been called weak, but now was a force that challenged the very foundation of their authority. Every empire relies on fear to control its citizens and armies, but when fear is misplaced, it can consume the controllers instead. She exploited the empire's overconfidence with precision. Skirmishes were won with minimal effort, communication networks disrupted, and supply chains sabotaged. Each calculated strike reminded her of the lessons learned in exile, the power of patience, the importance of observation, and the strength that came from embracing human adaptability. The empire relied on brute strength and technological superiority, but she relied on intellect, creativity, and relentless determination. Every miscalculation, every arrogance-driven decision, became a stepping stone toward the reckoning she had been preparing for since her public disgrace. The empire attempted to adapt, to counter her strategies, but their methods were predictable. Protocols dictated their responses, and rigid hierarchies slowed reaction time. They could not comprehend a human who thought beyond conventional measures, who anticipated their reactions and exploited every flaw with precision. The outcast had transformed from a figure of ridicule into an enigma that destabilized the empire's confidence. Their authority was absolute in theory, but in practice, it faltered in the face of ingenuity, unpredictability, and relentless human will. She began to strike at their psychology as much as their logistics. Messages, sightings, and rumors spread quickly through the empire, causing doubt and fear to fester. Leaders questioned orders, soldiers hesitated in critical moments, and minor defeats were magnified into crises. The empire's reliance on intimidation had been effective against those who accepted hierarchy without question, but humans like her did not. They thrived on challenge, on defiance, and on turning fear into strategy. Every empire has its blind spots, and she had identified them all. Every empire has its arrogance, and she knew exactly how to use it against them. Her victories were never loud, never boastful, but they were devastating in effect. Supply convoys disappeared, patrols failed, and critical operations collapsed in ways the empire could not trace. She left no unnecessary evidence, no overconfidence, no mistakes. Each success was a quiet message to the empire. You underestimated the human spirit. You mocked the outcast, and now you are paying the price. The empire, once untouchable, now trembled under the weight of uncertainty. In the council chambers, panic began to replace arrogance. Leaders who had been dismissive now demanded action, solutions, and accountability. The outcast they had humiliated was no longer simply surviving. She was dismantling the very fabric of their authority. The cracks in their confidence widened with every clever maneuver she executed. They had laughed at her weakness, but now they were realizing that human will, intelligence, and relentless focus could not be predicted, controlled, or defeated through conventional power. She did not celebrate her growing reputation within the empire. She understood the danger of complacency, the cost of underestimating a human mind. Her victories were lessons, her movements were strategies, and her patience was endless. She waited for the perfect moment, when preparation, opportunity, and timing would converge into a strike that the empire could not withstand. They had underestimated her, and the longer they did, the more absolute her power became. Every minor victory, every disruption, every carefully calculated move brought her closer to the moment that would define her. The empire had assumed they could erase her, dismiss her, and move on. Instead, they had forged a relentless adversary from their own arrogance. Humanity's greatest weapon was not strength or numbers. It was the ability to adapt, to endure, and to overcome when all odds seemed impossible. She embodied that truth, and the empire would soon learn, in the most devastating way possible, that the outcast they mocked had become a force they could not predict, a threat they could not contain, and a reckoning they could not survive. She struck with precision the empire had never anticipated. Every movement, every plan, every strike was executed with a clarity that could only come from preparation and understanding far beyond conventional strategy. The empire had dismissed her as an outcast, a human of no consequence, and now they faced the consequences of their arrogance. Her attacks were swift, calculated, and devastating, leaving confusion and fear in their wake. Soldiers who had once mocked her now trembled at the mention of her name, unsure if what they had heard was rumor or reality. Her genius lay not in brute force, but in unpredictability. She exploited the Empire's overconfidence, turning their most advanced technology against them, repurposing their weapons, and disrupting their operations with strategies that defied logic yet worked with precision. Every failure they suffered at her hands was not accidental. It was the result of careful observation, understanding, and patience. While they relied on overwhelming power, she relied on intelligence, adaptability, and the relentless human instinct to survive and overcome. The Empire's communication networks began to falter under her calculated strikes. Supply lines, critical infrastructure, and strategic operations all experienced failures that seemed random but were meticulously orchestrated. Fear began to spread among soldiers and leaders alike. Where they had once commanded with absolute confidence, hesitation and doubt crept in. The outcast they had scorned was no longer invisible. She had become a shadow of inevitability, a constant reminder that their control was fragile and that their arrogance had blinded them to the strength of human resolve. She understood that battles were not always won through combat. Psychological warfare became her tool. She manipulated information, seeded rumors, and engineered scenarios that forced the Empire to question its own decisions. Leaders second-guessed their strategies, soldiers hesitated in critical moments, and the Empire's rigid order began to unravel from within. The outcast they had dismissed as weak had become a force that destabilized their confidence, proving that human ingenuity could challenge even the most structured and powerful of empires. Her victories inspired whispers among other oppressed beings, those who had long suffered under the Empire's rule. They saw in her actions the power of human tenacity, the ability to turn disadvantage into advantage, and the courage to defy authority. Even in isolation, her influence spread, demonstrating that a single determined individual could ignite hope and inspire change far beyond her immediate reach. Humanity's strength was not only in its resilience, but in its capacity to innovate, to strategize, and to rise against seemingly insurmountable odds. Every engagement she executed was a masterclass in strategy. She struck quickly, withdrew without trace, and allowed the Empire to overreact, making predictable mistakes that she exploited with precision. Their technology, once a symbol of invincibility, became a liability in her hands. Where they relied on machines and rigid protocols, she relied on creativity, foresight, and the ability to anticipate their every move. Every failed counterattack reminded the Empire that underestimating a human was a mistake that could not be undone. The Empire attempted to respond, deploying their best forces and most advanced strategies, but each effort was met with unforeseen resistance and clever manipulation. Her victories were not merely physical. They were intellectual, tactical, and psychological. The Empire had built its supremacy on control and fear, but she had discovered that human adaptability and intelligence could undermine even the most absolute authority. Each strike eroded their confidence, each disruption challenged their assumption of superiority, and each minor defeat fed the momentum that was steadily building toward something greater, a reckoning they could not escape. As the Empire struggled to maintain order, she continued to exploit every weakness, every oversight, and every arrogance-driven decision. Her attacks became bolder, more precise, and increasingly impossible to predict. The outcast had become a strategist of unparalleled skill, capable of dismantling systems from within while remaining unseen, untouchable, and unstoppable. Soldiers who had once laughed at her cunning now feared her insight, realizing that the human mind could achieve what brute strength alone could never accomplish. The tide of events began to shift irreversibly. The Empire's leaders faced a truth they could not ignore. The outcast they had humiliated had become a force they could not contain. Her reputation spread like wildfire, instilling fear and uncertainty in every corner of their dominion. Every plan they executed, every resource they deployed, every order they issued was now shadowed by the possibility of failure, a failure orchestrated by the very human they had once dismissed. Their arrogance had blinded them to the inevitability of her rise, and now they could see the consequences. Her victories culminated in a series of decisive operations that shook the Empire to its core. Strategic centers fell under her influence, communications were compromised, and key resources were rendered useless. The Empire that had once mocked her now faced the reality of human ingenuity and resilience. They realized, perhaps too late, that power was not defined by armies or technology alone, but by the will to endure, to adapt, and to strike with precision when all others assumed victory. The outcast had become a symbol of unstoppable human force. Every calculated move, every clever maneuver, Every demonstration of skill and foresight reminded the Empire of a truth they had never truly understood. Humans were not to be underestimated. Weakness was a lie, and ingenuity was a weapon far deadlier than any machine. The Empire's confidence eroded with each passing day, and the outcast's influence only grew, an unstoppable tide that threatened to consume everything they had built. She did not slow her momentum. Every operation, every maneuver, every strike brought her closer to a confrontation that would define the fate of the Empire. The fire within her burned brighter with every victory, fueled by the injustice they had inflicted and the certainty that humanity would not be denied. She was no longer merely a survivor. She was a force of precision, intellect, and determination, a human embodiment of the unstoppable, a storm that the Empire could not anticipate and could not withstand. Every empire has its blind spots, every ruler its arrogance, every system its vulnerability. She had identified them all and exploited them without hesitation. The outcast they had dismissed as weak had become a storm of intellect, strategy, and human will. When the final confrontation came, the Empire would realize that mocking humanity had been their greatest mistake, underestimating the outcast their most costly error, and ignoring the human spirit their ultimate downfall. The Empire had grown desperate. Every countermeasure they deployed, every fleet they sent, every command they issued was anticipated, neutralized, or turned against them. They had mocked her, dismissed her, and branded her weak, but the outcast they had scorned was now the architect of their unraveling. The full force of their arrogance and power collided with the precision, ingenuity, and relentless determination of a single human mind, and they were unprepared for the storm that followed. She moved with a calm born of preparation and inevitability. Years of exile, study, and relentless practice had honed her into a force no empire could contain. Every attack she launched was surgical, every maneuver calculated, and every strategy flawless. Soldiers who had once believed themselves untouchable fell to ingenuity they could not comprehend. Leaders who had prided themselves on foresight found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The Empire had relied on superiority and order, but she relied on unpredictability, adaptability, and human determination, qualities that no machine or protocol could match. The first wave of her final offensive was swift and devastating. Critical supply lines, communication hubs, and strategic command centers were neutralized before the Empire could even comprehend the scope of the assault. Their forces scrambled in disarray, trying to respond to a threat they had dismissed for far too long. Confusion reigned, hesitation spread, and the once mighty Empire faltered. It was not overwhelming numbers or brute force that brought them to their knees, but the relentless, calculated will of a human who refused to be defined by weakness. She exploited every weakness, both physical and psychological. Troops faltered when confronted with impossible choices. Leaders questioned themselves when decisions led to failure. The Empire's arrogance became its own undoing. Each strike she made reinforced the human principle that intelligence, adaptability, and courage could overturn even the most absolute power. Where they had relied on fear, intimidation, and strict hierarchy, she relied on unpredictability, ingenuity, and relentless focus. Every empire has limits, every tyrant a blind spot, and every force a vulnerability. She found them all and struck without hesitation. The human mind's ingenuity shone brightest in the face of adversity. She turned their own technology into instruments of her strategy, repurposed their weapons against them, and exploited the smallest miscalculations with precision. Every empire assumes its supremacy is absolute, every ruler assumes their control is unchallengeable, and every army assumes its strength guarantees victory. She proved all of them wrong. Her brilliance was not in the strength of her blows, but in the depth of her understanding, the clarity of her strategy, and the unyielding force of human resolve. As the empire's defenses crumbled, its leaders realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had dismissed a human, underestimated an outcast, and in doing so had unleashed a force they could not contain. Panic spread, orders collided, and morale collapsed. Every victory she had claimed was now magnified in effect, every minor disruption now pivotal. The empire was no longer a machine of control. It had become a battlefield of chaos, guided by the intellect and will of one human who refused to be broken. Her strikes were not merely acts of vengeance, they were lessons. Every defeat she inflicted demonstrated the principles of human ingenuity, adaptability, creativity, and relentless perseverance. Soldiers who had once been confident in their invincibility now trembled, unsure of how to confront an adversary whose brilliance could not be predicted, whose determination could not be measured, and whose strategy exceeded any conventional understanding. Humanity, they realized too late, was more than a species. It was a force capable of outthinking, outmaneuvering, and overwhelming even the most advanced empire. In the final confrontation, the empire's might clashed with her precision and intellect, and the results were inevitable. Every effort to crush her failed. Every weapon deployed against her was anticipated, every strategy countered. Their arrogance had blinded them to the human capacity for adaptation and ingenuity. The outcast, once scorned and humiliated, became the unstoppable force that brought their empire to the brink of collapse. Where they expected weakness, they encountered brilliance. Where they expected fear, they encountered courage. Where they expected submission, they encountered the full measure of human will. The empire fell not because of superior firepower, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because they underestimated a human. She had turned humiliation into fuel, exile into preparation, and underestimation into opportunity. Every empire has its limits, every tyrant its blind spot, and every structure of control its vulnerability. She found them all and dismantled them with relentless precision. Humanity, she demonstrated, was not a force to be mocked, dismissed, or underestimated. It was a force to be reckoned with, unstoppable, unyielding, and brilliant in ways no empire could anticipate. As silence settled over the remnants of the empire, she stood not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a testament to the power of human determination. The outcast who had been laughed at, scorned, and dismissed had become the instrument of reckoning, the embodiment of intelligence, ingenuity, and resilience. Humanity had proven that it could overcome, adapt, and prevail against forces that seemed absolute. The empire's fall was not simply a victory, it was proof of the unstoppable nature of the human spirit. And in that quiet aftermath, as the survivors of the empire faced the consequences of their arrogance, one truth became undeniable. The outcast they had scorned was no longer weak, no longer invisible, and no longer dismissible. She was the living testament to humanity's indomitable will, the symbol of a species that refused to be constrained by expectation, and the harbinger of doom for any who believed that humans could be underestimated. The empire had branded her as nothing. She became everything they feared, and more. The human spirit, unbroken and unstoppable, had struck, and the universe would remember her fury forever.